Whether your business is small, medium, large or extra large, there's a retirement solution for every type of business. oldmutualsuperfund.co.za.
Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and of course you're watching CNBC Africa, where we continue unpacking the implications of the 2013 budget. The bulk of Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan's budget is to be spent on social services, totaling 682.3 billion rand, which is an increase of 7.8%. Well, to take a closer look at the socio-political implications of today's budget, I'm joined by an esteemed panel. In Johannesburg, I am with Eusebius Mkhize. He is from the Wits Ethics Centre, and of course also with the Executive Director of Naledi, which is a Labour think tank, Rudy Dix. Later on in the program, we will also be joined by Nick Borain, who's a political analyst at BNP Paribas Credit Security. But let's start with our guests up in Johannesburg. Eusebius, good evening, welcome to the show. Of course, the usual suspects getting the larger slice of the budget pie, with a very strict caveat. Frills have to be cut, expenditure have to be rolled out. If not, it will be taken back. Do you think this is a big enough stick for the state?
That's a very difficult question, Karima, because in the past we have seen that when there have been audits of where there have either been wasteful expenditure or even more callous than that, a lack of expenditure in some provincial governments, for example, the state hasn't always been effective in managing to follow through on threats. And I am very happy with the overall expenditure. You're right that a big slice goes to social security in a country with deep income inequality, with massive poverty and with unemployment levels unofficially around 40%. It is unsurprising. It's also morally and politically correct. But I must say I'm cautiously happy with the budget in the sense that it all depends on whether the different actors, the political principals, now take the goodwill that we have as a nation and make sure that they manage those budgets properly. It's all about the actual spending and not so much about the allocation.
Rudy, you have certainly looked at state capacity in many instances as Naledi. Does the critical departments, particularly in provincial levels of government, where a lot of the expenditure is to be driven, if one looks last year at the cabinet having to introduce a special resolution intervening in 5 departments in a place like Limpopo, is this money going to be properly spent? Are projects going to come in on time and on budget?
Well, again, I think Eusebius is right. I think that's very important, and that kind of announcement that is made in the budget is something that has happened before. I think it's fairly critical. I think also that there's a particular unit that has been set up in Treasury, because it's not only provinces, it's local government also, where there are going to be massive infrastructure projects that I think are also just as critical and has to be delivered. So it's important for us to be able to develop adequate monitoring and performance systems in government to be able to ensure that that is met and that those monies are spent. I think the idea of trying to, for example, put adequate planning in place, and so of course the minister talked about a 2-year process, of planning for infrastructure investment as part of a critical process in terms of money allocation. I think that helps in terms of better planning and spending, of course, at the end of the day. Of
course, the teachers are going to be happy with the fact that they are getting an increase. A lot of people will argue that they don't necessarily deserve it. You've done a lot of research on entry levels for teachers, which are quite high, but of course the difficulty is the remuneration for those with experience, and that's where we fall down and we can't keep them. Do you think that this is an attempt to reach out and retain skills, particularly in a critical area such as education?
Absolutely. I think that's going to be fairly critical. Not only education, health services, justice, and across a number of other public service jobs that are also critical and scarce, where scarce skills are important. So yes, I do think so. But I think it's important. You asked early on whether the question around whether this, the kind of expenditure on the budget. It's important to note that real expenditure does decrease. So there's what we're seeing is a slight contraction in actual fiscal spend. Yes. You'll see the reduction in the estimates of the budget deficit from what it has been at the particular level to 2015 forecasted at 3.1%. So what we're seeing is a real reduction in actual fiscal spend, and so of course government has to make up in some way or another to be able to pay those kind of expenditure items that have been identified.
Let us bring in our analyst down in Cape Town, Nick Borain, who's a political analyst at BNP Paribas Credit Securities. Nick, we've been chatting here with the analysts, and I hope that you've been able to listen in on our conversation. Very few surprises in terms of the kind of emphasis of the budget, but very interestingly, no severe austerity measures other than very tough recommendations on how to curb spending. Do you think that Pravin Gordhan was making a political statement by not going the austerity route and sticking to, infrastructure spend as a way to kickstart growth in the economy?
Hi, Karima. Look, I think that for someone like me, what I'm looking for in a budget like this is an election year budget, a budget that's written as a Gang has been formed, as the DA is crowing that it's going to that it's doing better, and it's that as post Marikana, where there's a massive defection in the ANC's a key constituency for the ANC to AMCU, from NUM to AMCU, and a range of similar the service delivery protests as tracked by Municipal IQ. So what I'm looking for in a budget like this is evidence that it's populist, evidence that he's going to tax, that he's going to spend as a way to keep the ANC's, I suppose, to buy the ANC support. I mean, I think my feeling is that the ANC is to some degree addicted to a combination of social grants and the public sector wage bill. And so for me, a crucial aspect was how much are those going up in real terms into this future? And I mean, my answer to that question is fairly balanced, and I think it has gone up. It's gone up significantly. The public sector wage bill, which is 38% of non-interest government spending, has gone up. It's predicted to go up over 7.9%. Social grants by 5%, but social grants is a smaller portion. This is serious. These are, I think he's worked in the space, but it's a very narrowing fiscal space. And ultimately, it's about those who lend South Africa money to finance the gap. Are they going to be happy? Are they going to trust him? Has he hidden anything? Are his revenue projections over the next 3 or 4 years realistic?
Okay, let's shift gear a little bit and go to an attempt to answer some of those questions around whether, in fact, job creation can be kickstarted. We've seen in typical kind of ANC style a balancing of the contradictions that are in the alliance. We see a tax incentive to businesses for bringing in young people, and we also see what looks to me like a job seekers grant proposed by the ANC at its policy conference back in July last year in economic zones that will be specially designated. UCBS, is this a very fine balancing act that Pravin has pulled off?
Absolutely, and a budget by definition is a political process of thinking through how to manage limited resources in a country in terms of what you've got into the income tax coffers and other forms of taxation and how you're going to spend it. And Nick was being quite coy there, but I think simmering beneath these euphemisms is probably a fear that the welfare budget is becoming too big and that there's not enough more of a blunt instrument being used to try and gain efficiencies where there are inefficiencies within the state. And I think you should put it that bluntly because those are real concerns. But anyone who's got half an historic brain will appreciate that Pravin Gordhan had to ensure that social security remains the biggest allocative space in terms of where the budget goes, Karima. And I think when it comes to unemployment, to answer you more directly, of course it was an attempt to say, we want to delicately intervene in debates like the youth wage subsidy. We might call it something else, a job seekers one. But I think it was very clever. It wasn't just a case, as you and I said off air earlier, of saying here is a little bit of pocket money for you if you go into a special economic zone. It's also about real skills developments, because by isolating those economic zones, you are also saying, yes, we are prepared to subsidize would-be employed persons, but we want to do so in sectors of the economy where we also need those particular zones to feed into the infra plans, to feed into the big macroeconomic areas where job creation will come from.
Now, Rudy, your Labour Institute, your think tank, is aligned to Labour. So I'm going to ask you to put on your Labour hat here.
Sure.
Does the interventions that Pravin announced regarding getting young people into the economy, and my understanding is that this agreement is going to be signed on Friday at NEDLAC, does it satisfy the constituencies that were stuck in that negotiations for a good 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, if this agreement is going to be concluded, then clearly there's a degree of negotiations and a degree of satisfaction. Of course, when you have a negotiated outcome, there are compromises that are of course reached. But I think the labour movement generally has raised a number of economic issues in relation to the initial youth wage subsidy, so call it what you may.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's an agreement that some intervention is required, and I think COSATU, for example, and other federations have said that. We require interventions to be able to address youth employment, whether it's in some form of mechanism, job seekers grant as you talk about it, and you try and reduce the social cost of looking for employment, or any other opportunities that could incentivize young people to go and look for employment. I mean, I think these are issues that I think most likely would be contained in the kind of agreement that has been negotiated over many, many months at NEDLAC. And I think that's very, very critical, that we acknowledge that there's a problem and these are the kind of interventions. But can I come on to Nick's issue that he raises? I mean, I think for me, I mean, the point is that I don't agree with him that the ANC is addicted to social security and public service employment. I think that's absolutely, I mean, it's a kind of simplified way of looking at the kind of crisis that we sit with in South Africa. And generally, when you have a country where there's deep-rooted economic problems like high unemployment, massive amounts of inequality and poverty, then generally you have an active state, and that's what it's about.
Okay, guys, you're up in here in Joburg. Let me bring Nick in here to explain himself. Nick, let's come back to the central questions. Both the analysts here have taken issue with some of the issues that you've raised, particularly around what analysts like to call the ANC's inability to define what kind of state it wants. Does it want to be a welfare state? Does it want to be a developmental state? My question to you is, why can't it be both?
I think, of course, it can be both, and it's my turn, so let me take your guests there on. You see, I don't actually profoundly disagree with them, but let me put it this way. 1999, ZANU-PF conference, the door was broken down by war veterans. Their pension fund had been looted. The Mugabe regime recapitalized the pension fund by borrowing money, $2 billion American worth of American dollars, and it almost the fiscal cliff. They fell off the fiscal cliff. Now they were dependent on those forms of patronage. Now I'm not suggesting for a second that social grants are a form of patronage. They have saved undoubtedly hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives in this country. There is no more efficient method of getting money to the poor than the social grant system that we have. But we've got to acknowledge that there's a major contradiction building up in this. We can't go anywhere if 50% of our non-interest spending is caught up in, well, just the public sector wage bill and social grants. Now, those are going to be tensions in policy formulation going forward. To back away from that would be, well, I would like to suggest catastrophic. There'd have to be, well, what are we going to have, a Maggie Thatcher to come and brutally change the, and we know what the consequences of this country will be. And at some point they will have to back off. We can't afford it. We have to, as Pravin Gordhan constantly says, move from consumption to investment spending.
Yeah, well, it's getting very hot in here. My analysts in Joburg are putting up their hands like boys in class for their chance to speak.
Me,
let me get Rudy in. I'm going to close with you, serious.
No one disagrees with the fact that employment is central and pertinent, you know. That's what we need to do. And I think the minister correctly coins it by saying that, you know what, most central to all our economic issues and the program that we need to develop jobs. And I want to say, qualify that through decent jobs, because decent jobs are critical. You know, they deal with social security, they deal with health and safety, they deal with improved living standards. So that's quite critical. Jobs are pertinent, you know?
Okay, guys, I have to call a halt here. We have to pay the bills. We'll take a break now, but when we come back, I'm going to give you, CBS, a chance to go for Nick. We're taking a short break now, but when we return, we continue our analysis of the post-budget vote speech with an emphasis on the socio-political implications of the 2013 budget vote speech. Don't go away.